And with the shockwaves from the weekend military action in Venezuela still reverberating, there's new alarm over Donald Trump's foreign policy and threats to Greenland. Leaders of several European countries have declared their support for Greenland, saying it belongs to its people and only Greenland and Denmark can decide its future. Well, that joint statement came after President Trump renewed calls for Greenland, which is a Danish territory, to become part of the United States. Meanwhile, European leaders are meeting in Paris alongside President Zelensky to discuss security guarantees for Ukraine as part of any peace deal with Russia. Well, that meeting has been overshadowed by the dramatic weekend events, which saw the president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, seized in the capital Caracas and taken to New York. We'll have more on that in a moment. First, though, here's our diplomatic correspondent, James Landau.
The frozen wastes of Greenland are in Donald Trump's sights after his military action against Venezuela. He says he wants this Danish territory to become part of the United States. But NATO allies have other ideas. In a joint statement, the leaders of Britain, Denmark, France, Germany, Poland and Italy said security in the Arctic must be achieved collectively in conjunction with NATO allies, including the United States, by upholding the principles of the UN Charter, including sovereignty, territorial integrity and the inviolability of borders. Greenland, they said, belongs to its people. It is for Denmark and Greenland and them only to decide on matters concerning Denmark and Greenland.
It is not in the interests of NATO, the UK's national security or our collective security to question Greenland's future. We've heard very clearly from Denmark's leaders the implications for the NATO alliance.
And this, from one of Donald Trump's most senior officials, is why US allies are worried.
The United States should have Greenland as part of the United States. There's no need to even think or talk about this in the context that you're asking of a military operation. Nobody's going to fight the United States militarily over the future of Greenland.
The renewed focus on Greenland came after the US captured President Maduro of Venezuela, the White House claiming it had a right to control the so-called Western Hemisphere, both north and south of the US mainland. On the streets of Caracas, there was high security, the country's justice minister joining police, hoping to show that order remains despite the departure of Maduro. Supporters of the deposed Venezuelan leader have been protesting his seizure by the United States, calling in vain for his return. One person who says she's hoping to come back is the opposition leader Maria Corina Machado, who praised the US military attack on her country and called for fresh elections.
January 3rd will go down in history as the day justice defeated a tyranny. It's a milestone, and it's not only huge for the Venezuelan people and our future. I think it's a huge step for humanity, for freedom and human dignity.
But Ms. Machado's whereabouts are not known, and she's currently facing arrest if she returns. That's because while Maduro may be gone, his government is not. This was his former deputy, Delcy Rodriguez, being sworn in as interim president, someone the opposition accuses of being one of the main architects of Maduro's corruption and narco-trafficking. But the focus now is turning north to Greenland, where European leaders fear any US aggression could put at risk the entire transatlantic alliance. James Landau, BBC News.
Well, let's speak to our international editor, Jeremy Bowen. And Jeremy, fair to say that alarm bells going across European capitals after all those comments about Greenland?
Yeah, with good reason, because the comments are being made in the case of Mr. Miller that you were hearing then in that CNN interview by one of the most powerful people in the White House under the president, one of his most influential advisors, a man who is one of the ideologues of the whole idea of MAGA. Make America Great Again. And if you watch the entire interview, you would see the extraordinary sense of entitlement, of power. And I got from it to a sense that the Americans feel they're so strong they can use their power with impunity.
In terms of that statement that I was referring to in the headlines, we had a statement of support for Greenland from European leaders. How is that likely to go down in the White House, do you think?
Well, I think they might well shrug and say, well, they're bound to say that, aren't they? They have to do it because there are smart people there. They will pick up on the fact that there has been a lot of very careful footwork, you might say, by European leaders, not least Britain's Prime Minister Keir Starmer, about trying to find a way to say the things that actually a lot of them believe in, like international law is very important, and at the same time not to enrage or antagonize Donald Trump or his advisors and closest and most senior officials. So it's a very difficult situation that they're in. I think, though, that the message that's coming out of this whole Venezuela business since it happened, and it's good to look back at what the Secretary of State, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said in the immediate aftermath in that first news conference that Trump gave at Mar-a-Lago in Florida at the weekend. And he said, look, when will people realize that when this president says he's going to do something, he'll do it? And I think that that lesson is actually hitting home and people realize, and there is potentially a massive crisis in the making over Greenland if the Americans push ahead with all of this, because it's hard to see how what remains of what's now a badly fractured so-called Western Alliance, Atlantic Alliance, it's very hard to see how it survives something like that. Yeah, it probably would in name and in rhetoric, and they find a way through things they might think, but actually alliances work. NATO particularly has worked on trust over many years. The idea that other countries, especially the US, will come to the aid of other members of that alliance who will contribute in their own different ways. But now the US is saying, look, we're the top dog. Don't forget that. We do what we want. And the kind of worldview that Donald Trump has been clearly, and his officials have clearly been expounding in the last few days is a world where power matters above all, where powerful countries have spheres of influence, and within those spheres of influence, they can demand that other countries do as they're told. They can break into the sovereignty of those countries, and if necessary, help themselves to their natural resources, Venezuelan oil, and of course, Greenland. As the ice melts, there are supposedly lots of rare earths and other important things that people can mine eventually, when eventually they're developed, long-term projects, of course, in the future.
The Danish Prime Minister was absolutely clear yesterday when she was talking about any prospect of an attack. She said it would be the end of NATO. For European leaders, you mapped out earlier that they've been walking this tightrope of managing Donald Trump, not confronting him. We are fast getting to a point, if there was any sort of move on Greenland, where there would have to be some sort of confrontation, wouldn't there?
Well, I think if they don't stick up for another European country and a fellow member of NATO, then yes, any of the fine words about solidarity and about international law and about the reason why European countries support Ukraine is because that President Putin has been riding a coach and horses through international law. It's already a difficult and, you might say, hypocritical process when it's clear that the Americans have done that, because what they did in Venezuela, and Maduro was a bad man, very clearly, but if you look at the UN Charter, they have broken it with no doubt about, in terms of what they've done. They argue it was justified, that the ends justified the means, and there are voices, of course, in the UK who would very much agree with that. However, it's very difficult longer term to see how they get through a crisis over Greenland without doing continued severe damage to relationships across the Atlantic.
Jeremy, thanks very much for that.